My daughter came crashing into my lakeside home with 5 designer suitcases and declared, "We're taking the master bedroom. You and Mom can sleep in the basement." When I quietly refused, her husband snatched my wife's favorite oak chair and flung it straight at my face. Blood ran down my neck, but my daughter only screamed, "You're so selfish. Look what you made him do." I drove myself to the emergency room, got 6 stitches, then sent my lawyer 4 words. It's time to act. My name is Eugene Harlow. Most people call me Gene. I am 71 years old, and for 42 years I pulled wire-bent conduit and crawled through the electrical guts of commercial buildings all across South Carolina. I built my company up from a single flatbed truck and a worn leather tool belt into one of the largest commercial electrical contracting firms in the Southeast. I never bragged about it, never felt the need. That Tuesday afternoon in October, I was settled into my armchair by the window, reading the newspaper the way I had every afternoon since retiring, a mug of black tea on the side table and the pale autumn light pressing soft through the curtains. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. If these stories have ever made you feel less alone, consider staying close. There are more where this one came from, and I think you'll want to hear them. Before we go any further, tell me, if you had to sum up how you're sitting with this story right now, what single word would you use? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. One thing I want you to know: some details in this account have been shaped for the purposes of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth inside the story. Outside, the water sat still and colorless under a heavy sky. Vera was somewhere in the kitchen. I tracked her by sound, the gentle drag of a pot shifting on the burner, the soft, wordless tune she hummed whenever a recipe demanded her full attention. That was my last moment of peace for a long time to come. The front door didn't ease open. It came off its hinges, practically thrown back so hard the handle punched the wall, and Derek Schofield strode through like a man who had already signed the title. Renata followed a half-step behind him, chin raised, that designer coat of hers, without a single wrinkle, her gaze moving across my living room, the way an appraiser's does, cool measuring, already deciding what stays and what goes. Derek was 38, built like someone whose fitness routine happened in hotel fitness centers, rather than anywhere involving actual labor. He had on a navy blazer over a white shirt, no tie, that studied, effortless look that costs a lot of money to achieve, and is meant to tell you he doesn't have to work at anything. Without a word, he unloaded 5 massive designer suitcases onto my hardwood floor. The thud rolled through the boards under my feet. I folded my newspaper and set it aside. "Derek," I said, then "Renata." Not a greeting returned by either of them. Renata squared her arms across her chest and regarded me with the flat patience of someone evaluating a piece of second-hand furniture, deciding whether it merits keeping. "Dad, we are moving in," she said. There was a brightness to her tone, a crisp efficiency she put on whenever a decision had already been made, and what followed was merely announcement. Derek had a big project drawing him toward the city. The condo was going into renovation. They'd need the master bedroom. My things should be down in the basement before nightfall. I held her gaze a while before I answered. I turned to Derek. He was drifting in a slow loop around my living room, hands buried in his pockets, eyes traveling up to the crown, molding upper lip just barely lifted like a man ticking boxes on an inspection form. Vera stepped into the doorway from the kitchen, a dish towel pulled between her hands. Her eyes went from Renata to Derek to the pile of luggage and finally settled on me. She didn't speak, but I watched the line of her jaw go rigid. My mind landed on the flannel shirt I had on, worn soft, fraying at both elbows. Renata had made it herself. When she was 12, spent 6 weeks on it, pulled it apart twice because the collar wouldn't lay the way she wanted. She brought it to me on Father's Day, rolled up in notebook paper, a bow she'd drawn on herself. 2 years back at Christmas, Derek had clocked that shirt across a full dinner table and announced loud enough for every person there to catch it, "That ratty old thing makes you look like a janitor. Gene." Renata had laughed. I could still hear exactly how that laugh sounded. "No," I said. Derek went still. He came around slowly, and whatever civil front he'd been maintaining peeled off clean. "Excuse me," he said. I said no. I got to my feet and stood square. "You are not taking my bedroom," I told him, "and you are not setting up house here. If the condo renovation has you displaced, Greenville has plenty of hotels that will do nicely." Derek crossed the room toward me in 3 strides. This close, his cologne was sharp, and somewhere behind it was something else. a tightness and edge I couldn't name yet, though I would come to understand it well enough. "We are not asking you, Jean," he said, his voice pulled down to something quiet and deliberate, which landed harder than anger would have. "We are telling you. A grown man bouncing around alone in a 4-bedroom house, that's absurd. Your things go downstairs tonight. That's where this ends." I said, "This is my house. I bought it, and I paid for it, and I'll sleep wherever I please." Derek's expression shifted fast through several stages. The quiet control broke. "You ignorant old man," he said, his breathing gone ragged, chest heaving. "You don't have the first clue how things actually work out there. You wired buildings your whole career, and now you want to stand in front of me and act like you know something?" Renata let out a noise behind him. Not quite a groan, not quite a sigh, but somewhere between the two. "Dad, please," she said. "Just don't make this difficult. It doesn't need to be a whole production." I looked at my daughter, the same girl I had driven 4 hours each direction to see every single weekend of her freshman year at college, because she'd phoned me in tears the very first night, saying the food in the dining hall tasted like cardboard. The same girl I had kept company in a hospital waiting room for 11 straight hours when she was 8 years old, and her fever wouldn't break. I hadn't left that chair once until a doctor came out and confirmed she'd be fine. That same girl was there in my living room, asking me to take the basement so her husband could claim my bed. Derek crossed toward the dining table, his fingers wrapped around the back of one of the oak chairs, the set Vera and I had bought on the strength of my first commercial contract, the chairs she ran a cloth over faithfully every Sunday, without fail. He lifted it clear of the floor, and I saw it in his face before his arms had even moved. "Let me tell you what it is to watch something you put your whole working life into shatter in under 3 seconds. That chair carried weight beyond its wood. Vera and I had walked into a furniture warehouse on a Saturday morning in the spring of 1986. The ink on my first commercial electrical contract check, still practically fresh, a 6-unit apartment building on Greenville's east side, nothing grand but mine. Vera drew her fingers across the grain of that oak table and said, "Jean, this is real wood. This will outlast the both of us." She kept her word to those chairs every Sunday morning, every single one, for 38 years. Derek took hold of that chair, hauled back with everything he had, and launched it at my head. I got my left forearm up in time to deflect some of it, not enough. The oak edge caught me across the cheekbone and temple with a sound I registered in my bones before my ears did. The chair detonated against the wall, burst into 4 solid pieces that went skidding across the floor. I lurched back my hip, glancing off the armchair, and my hand flew to my face, warm, wet. My fingers came back red. The pain followed not instantly, but a beat later, a deep, brutal throb spreading out from the cheekbone, through the eye socket, and down into my jaw. The edges of my sight softened. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced myself upright, pressing my hand hard against my cheek, and I looked at my daughter. Renata hadn't shifted from the spot where she'd been standing. She hadn't moved toward me. She hadn't cried out. Her hands hung together in front of her. What was on her face wasn't shock or anguish. It was irritation, deep, thorough, and undisguised. The expression of someone who has had to watch an embarrassing scene unfold at the worst possible time. Look what you made him do, Dad," she said, tight, even not a tremor in it. "You are being so selfish. We are your family. We are asking for one simple thing, and you are turning it into this." She waved a hand at the blood, like I'd knocked over a glass of water, and only had myself to blame. "Derek is under enormous pressure right now, and you are only adding to it. You are so stubborn." Something split open inside me at that moment. Not because of the hit. I could absorb the hit. What I could not absorb was her voice, the total seamless lack of anything like worry over the sight of her father bleeding on the floor of his own home. That was the cut that went clear to the bone. Derek tugged his blazer straight, still breathing through his nose, still flushed across the face, but already reassembling that composed in-command bearing he carried around like armor. He raised a finger in my direction. "You have, until we get back from dinner," he said. "Have your things in the basement, or I'll move them down there myself." He scooped his car keys off the entry table, and the two of them moved toward the door, like they were wrapping up a mildly annoying errand. Renata never glanced back at me, not once. I stood there in the middle of my own living room, blood trailing down the side of my neck and soaking into the collar of that flannel shirt, the one her 12-year-old hands had knitted stitch by stitch. I watched the door pull shut behind her. Vera came around the corner from the kitchen. She had heard all of it. I could read that in her face, the color gone from her cheeks, her hands trembling around the dish towel she was still clutching. Her gaze landed on the blood and her breath caught hard. Jean. Just that single word, and her voice fractured on it. I am fine, I told her. You are not fine. She crossed to me quickly and took my face in both hands, tilting my head carefully to look at the cut. Her eyes full of tears she was determined not to shed. You need stitches. You need to go right now. I know, I said. She pressed the dish towel to my cheek and held it firm, her forehead tipping forward until it rested against mine. For a moment, we just stood that way, in the broken quiet of our living room, the splintered pieces of a chair she had polished every Sunday for 38 years scattered around our feet. Then she pulled back and looked me square in the face. Go, she said, no softness in it. Drive to Prisma Health. I will call Elliot. I lifted my keys from the hook beside the door. I walked out to my truck, got in, and angled the rearview mirror toward my face. The gash was deep and ragged and still seeping through the towel. My shirt was beyond saving. The whole left side of my cheek had already begun to swell. I picked up my phone and opened my messages. I pulled up the contact for Elliot Vance, my attorney, a man who had handled my commercial trusts and corporate holdings for 17 years, with a kind of quiet surgical precision that most people never know is available until the moment they desperately need it. I typed 4 words. It is time, Elliot. I hit send. I turned the key. And as I backed out of the driveway, something settled in my chest. Not anger exactly, not grief. Something colder than both and far more purposeful. The feeling that comes over a patient man the moment he decides his patience has run its course. The emergency room at Prisma Health Patewood carried that familiar smell, antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular low-grade dread that gathers in rooms where people show up after things have already gone badly wrong. A nurse named Claudette took one look at the blood-soaked dish towel pressed against my cheek and walked me straight past the waiting area, without asking me to fill out a single form. She settled me into an examination bay, pulled on a pair of gloves, and peeled the towel away from my face with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this kind of thing is an ordinary Tuesday. This is going to need stitches, she said. Not a question. I figured as much, I said. Can you tell me what happened? My son-in-law threw a solid oak chair at my face. Claudette looked up. Her hands went still for exactly 1 second. Then she reached for a fresh gauze pad and pressed it carefully against the wound. I'm going to have someone from our patient services team come speak with you before you leave, she said. Is that all right? That is perfectly all right, I told her. The doctor came in a few minutes after. Dr. Adeyemi, a compact, serious man with an unhurried steadiness in his hands, the kind that only comes from years in emergency medicine. He tipped my chin toward the overhead light and examined the gash with a small pen light. 5 stitches, he said, possibly 6. Any loss of consciousness, dizziness, nausea? None, I said. My head is completely clear. He reached for the anesthetic. This will burn for a moment. He wasn't wrong. The needle went in just beneath my cheekbone, and the pain flared hot and sharp, fanning upward toward my eye socket. I didn't make a sound. I had taken 277-volt shocks that knocked me clean off a ladder on a job site in Spartanburg. I had scorched my forearms on conduit running at 800 degrees, bro, inside an industrial plant in Anderson. A suture needle in a climate-controlled exam room was nowhere near the worst thing these hands had weathered. While Dr. Adeyemi worked, I fixed my eyes on the ceiling and let the memories surface the way they always do when you're lying flat with nothing left to do but wait. The first stitch shook something loose from deep down. Renata, at 8 years old, burning with a fever that would not quit. February, the coldest February Greenville had seen in 15 years. Vera and I drove her to the hospital at 2 in the morning, wrapped in the quilt from our own bed, because she couldn't stop shaking. The word pneumonia landed in my chest like a dropped tool, heavy and all wrong. I sat in a plastic chair outside the pediatric unit for 11 hours. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. Vera gripped my hands so tightly my fingers went numb. I didn't move because moving felt like conceding something. When the doctor finally came out and told us she was stable, that she was asking for her dad, I walked into that room and perched on the edge of her bed and held her hand between both of mine. Her fingers were so small against my scarred palms, impossibly small. You scared me half to death, little girl, I told her. She looked up at me with those big dark eyes and said, I'm sorry, Daddy. I told her she had nothing on this earth to be sorry for. The second stitch brought up a different memory. Renata at 16 circling a dress in a department store catalog for 3 straight weeks. Pale blue off the shoulder, $78. She never once asked me for it. She just left the catalog sitting on the kitchen table with the corner of the page turned down and acted like she'd forgotten all about it. I picked up 3 extra night shifts that month on a commercial retrofit job in Concord and bought the dress without a word said. Left it on her bed in a box with a card that read, "Happy Tuesday." She came downstairs with her eyes red and hugged me around the neck so hard I lost my breath. She didn't say I looked like a janitor back then. The third stitch surfaced the memory of her graduation day. She crossed that stage in Columbia, and I was seated in the 3rd row, a paper program in my lap. When they called her name, my throat closed down so completely I couldn't have made a sound if my life depended on it. Vera seized my arm with both hands and squeezed. I pressed my lips together, blinked hard, and reminded myself that a 63-year-old man with grease permanently worked into his knuckles does not cry in public. I was not entirely successful, and then today standing in my own home with blood running down my neck, watching my daughter look at my face and register nothing but irritation. Dr. Adeyemi clipped the final stitch and set his instruments down. 6, he confirmed. You are going to have significant bruising by morning. Ice it tonight and come back in 10 days to have these taken out. Understood, I said. He passed me a small mirror. I studied the white bandage covering the left side of my face. I looked at the dried blood still on my collar. I looked at my own eyes looking back at me, and I did not see a frightened old man. I saw someone who had just made up his mind. My phone buzzed on the examination table. Elliot Vance. I picked up immediately. I got your message, Elliot said. His voice was level and precise, same as always. I told him everything, all of it. The luggage dropped on my floor, the demand for the bedroom, the chair, Renata's voice when she said selfish. By the time I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. I have been waiting for you to make this call for 2 years, Elliot said. I will have the police at your house within the hour. Jean, do not go back there tonight. I know, I said. There is somewhere else I need to be. I set the phone down, rose slowly, and took one last look at myself in the mirror. Somewhere across town, Derek Schofield was settled into my leather recliner, drinking my wine and savoring a victory that was going to strip away everything he had ever built and everything he had ever taken. He just didn't know that yet. I sat in the cab of my truck in the Prisma Health Patewood parking lot, engine idling heater, running low phone propped against the steering wheel. The bandage on my cheek tugged slightly every time I worked my jaw. Outside, the October sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the parking lot lights were already flickering on, even though it wasn't yet 4 in the afternoon. I opened the security app on my phone. The system I'd put in 6 months earlier was commercial grade, the same hardware I used to spec out for corporate warehouse facilities and pharmaceutical distribution centers. 8 cameras, crystal clear, motion-activated, cloud-backed, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. The living room feed came up first. Derek was in my leather recliner shoes, kicked off feet propped on my walnut coffee table. One of my crystal tumblers in his right hand, filled with something dark red. I knew the bottle the moment I laid eyes on it. A 2007 Stag's Leap Cabernet I had been saving for 15 years. A bottle I'd bought the year Vera and I celebrated paying off the mortgage on our first commercial property. Derek had gone down to my private cellar, found it pulled the cork, and was drinking it alone in my chair, like a man who just claimed a trophy. Renata stood at the mouth of the hallway with her phone out, filming the room. She was smiling into the camera, tilting her head the way she always did in photographs, her lips moving. She was recording a video, showing someone the space putting on display what she'd just seized. My chest tightened so hard, I had to press a fist against my sternum. Then, the red and blue lights arrived. 3 Greenville County police cruisers pulled up to the front of the house, at the same time their light bars throwing fractured color across the living room windows. Derek's head snapped up from the recliner. He lurched forward so quickly the crystal tumbler sloshed red wine down the front of his shirt. His feet dropped off the table and hit the floor. He stood and straightened his jacket by reflex, which struck me as almost funny. The man had just put a solid oak chair into a 71-year-old's face, and his first instinct when law enforcement walked in was to fix his jacket. 4 officers came through the front door. Even through the muffled audio of the app, their voices carried that particular brand of authority that doesn't open itself up for discussion. Derek raised both hands and started talking fast. I couldn't catch every word, but the shape of it was familiar, respected professional, misunderstanding, family dispute. He was reaching for the same polished boardroom vocabulary he used to make people feel they were dealing with a man who didn't get inconvenienced. The officers didn't shift their posture by a single degree. Two of them moved around Derek's flanks while he was still mid-sentence. They weren't tracking his words. They were tracking the blood still visible near the dining table and the shattered remnants of the oak chair stacked against the wall where I'd swept them before leaving. The evidence told its own story, and no amount of smooth talk was going to rewrite it. Derek's expression changed the instant the first officer reached for his arm. The consultant's mask dropped completely. Genuine shock moved across his face, the shock of a man who has gone his entire adult life without once being told that his words carry no weight here. "You cannot do this," he said, his voice climbing. "Do you know who I am? I am a licensed real estate professional. I have attorneys. I will have your badges by the end of the week." The officer holding his arm said quietly and without any particular interest, "Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Derek went from shock to outright panic. He started pulling against the officer's grip, which was exactly the wrong move, and within seconds 2 more officers had him turned and pressed against the wall. The handcuffs clicked into place, with a sound I registered more in my jaw than my ears clean and metallic through the phone speaker, and I felt the tension leave my face for the first time in hours. Renata was in the far corner of the room. Her phone had fallen to her side, and she stood with both palms flat against the wall, her face drained white. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't crying. She was watching her husband get handcuffed in the home she had announced just hours ago was hers, and she had the look of a woman watching the floor give way beneath her. Then she found her voice. "Stop!" she screamed, lunging forward. "Stop! You do not understand. He did not do anything. Our family had an argument. My father provoked him. You cannot arrest him for a family argument." One of the officers stepped smoothly between her and Derek, one hand raised. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." "He is my husband," Renata cried, her voice going sharp and unsteady. "He has a career. He has a reputation. You are going to destroy his career over a misunderstanding." Vera stepped into the camera frame. She had been standing in the kitchen doorway the whole time, and I hadn't noticed her until that moment. She was still holding the dish towel from earlier. She walked with measured steps into the center of the room, past the broken chair pieces, past the officers, and stood there with her arms at her sides, watching Derek being guided toward the front door. She did not scream. She did not plead. Her face was composed and still, and her eyes followed Derek with an expression I had only seen on her once before. The same look she'd given the contractor who tried to cheat us on materials in 1993, right before she called his bonding company and had his license pulled. It was the face of a woman who had already decided how this ends. I turned my phone face down on the passenger seat. I put the truck in reverse and pulled out of the lot. My cheek throbbed steadily under the bandage, and outside the windows the evening had gone fully dark and cold. As I merged onto the highway heading south toward home, my mind wasn't on Derek in handcuffs. It was on Vera standing in the middle of that room, perfectly still and certain, while everything around her came apart. 45 years of marriage, and she could still catch me off guard. The kitchen light was burning when I turned into the driveway, warm and yellow through the glass. I sat in the truck for a moment and just looked at it. 45 years of coming home to that light. 45 years of stepping through that door and finding Vera somewhere in the house, at the stove, at the table, in the armchair, by the window, and feeling that particular relief that has no name, but that you would know in an instant if it were ever taken from you. I went inside. Vera was at the kitchen table, a mug of tea in front of her, and a small stack of papers set to one side. She looked up when I came through the door, and her eyes went straight to the bandage. She pressed her lips together hard and glanced away for exactly 1 second, gathering herself, then looked back. "Sit down, Jean," she said. I sat across from her. She got up without a word, poured a mug of black tea from the pot she'd kept warm, and set it in front of me. No sugar. Exactly how I'd taken it for 45 years. "How many stitches?" she asked, settling back down. 60, I said. She gave one tight nod. "Good, doctor. Very good." She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me with an expression I'd spent decades learning to read. It meant she had something to say and was working out where to start. "I have to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." "All right," I said. Vera drew a slow breath. 3 weeks ago, when Renata and Derek came for Sunday dinner, Renata used the iPad in the living room to check her email. She left it sitting open on the counter when she went to help carry dishes. Vera's jaw went tight. I was not trying to look. I was setting a glass down, and the screen was right there. "What did you see?" I asked. "Foreclosure notice," Vera said. Her voice didn't waver. Summit Financial. 6 months of payments missed on the downtown condo, and the bank had already begun the process to take it back before the month was up. She let that sit. On top of that, 2 separate emails from an IRS collections unit and a letter from a debt resolution attorney. The mug was warm between my palms. I held my tongue. "I didn't bring this to you that night," Vera went on, and her voice went to that lower register she only found when honesty was costing her something. "Because I knew you'd go straight at them, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I had to be certain first." She pushed the papers across the table until they were in front of me. "So, the morning after I rang Elliot, I looked at what she'd put there. Elliot Vance's letterhead at the top. Below it, tight columns of financial detail. Derek owes the IRS $1.4 million, Vera said. Back taxes, interest penalties stacked on top. His brokerage accounts are locked. The condo is already lost. For at least 4 years, he's been lying to his clients about the returns he was producing money. He never actually made them." She laid both hands flat on the table's surface. "He is flat broke Gene. The two of them were days away from losing everything." I turned to the second page. Every figure was exactly as grim as she'd described. "He didn't come here because of any city project," I said. "No," Vera said. "He had no other options left. His plan was to get into this house, force you out, and then leverage it against the IRS to buy himself breathing room." She held my gaze without flinching. "This wasn't some snap decision. Elliot told me Derek had someone run your property records 8 months back. 8 months. That number settled into me like a weight. Derek had been executing this while sitting at our Thanksgiving table. While Vera passed him food she had cooked. While he shook my hand at the door on his way out. "Did Renata know?" I asked. Vera's face changed. Something crossed it that wasn't grief exactly and wasn't anger exactly, but it lived in the territory between them, where the worst kind of hurt tends to take up residence. How much she knew, I honestly cannot say, she told me. But she knew enough. Nothing moved in the kitchen but the refrigerator's low drone. Through the window, the lake sat dark and motionless. 3 weeks you held this by yourself, I said. Why? Vera dropped her eyes to the mug in front of her. Her grip around it tightened. Because I kept telling myself I had it wrong, she said barely above a whisper. I kept going back to the same thought. This is our daughter. She wouldn't turn around and look at what we put together over a lifetime and treat it like something to harvest. The last word snagged in her throat just for a moment before she brought herself back. But today she watched you standing there with blood on your face, and the word that came out of her mouth was selfish. Vera raised her eyes to mine, and they were full of tears she was not going to let fall. That's when I stopped telling myself I had it wrong. I slid my hand across the table and covered hers. Her knuckles were cold and rigid, and she locked her fingers around mine with real force. The same grip she'd had on me in the hospital 23 years ago when Renata was ill, and neither of us knew how it would go. Tonight was different. We weren't frightened. What we were was something else, something colder and more final than fear. My phone vibrated against the table. I flipped it over. Renata's name. It rang through 4 times, broke the kitchen's quiet, and dropped to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it began again. Vera looked at the phone, then at me. She is not calling to say she's sorry, she said. I know, I said. I turned it over and left it where it was. Sleep found me for maybe 2 hours before the noise pulled me back. It wasn't a knock-knocking, it's something you do when you're asking. What Derek brought to my front door at 2 in the morning was force. Repeated heavy rhythmic impact, a boot driving into solid wood over and over, with everything a grown man has. The vibration of it traveling up through the joists into the walls, through the bed frame beneath me. I didn't reach for the light. I grabbed the tablet off the nightstand and opened the front porch camera. The motion light had triggered washing the porch in stark white. There was Derek still in the same clothing he'd had on when the officers walked him out in cuffs. But the blazer was crushed now, the white collar of his shirt open, and grimed his hair matted down over his forehead. A man who'd spent the last several hours inside a cell, and it hadn't suited him. Renata stood a step behind him, arms wound tight around herself in a long coat, eyes constantly sweeping the street. checking which windows had gone bright. Derek's boot found the door again. The wood absorbed it and shook. "Open this door right now, Jean." He roared, nothing left of the polished professional, now just something raw and ugly beneath. "Open it, or I swear to God, you will regret every single decision you made today." Vera sat up next to me, no sharp intake of breath. She took the tablet from my hands, looked at the scene for a few seconds, and handed it back with an expression that had nothing left to learn from it. "He got out," she said. "Apparently," I said. "You want to guess how many cards Renata drained to post that bail tonight?" Vera asked. "I wouldn't take that wager," I said. Derek hit the door again, and once more after that. Then he stepped back and shouted up toward where he figured the bedroom windows were. "You think you can do this to me? I'm going to take everything you own. I'm going to make sure you spend whatever time you have left in a place that smells like a hospital cafeteria. You are nothing, Jean. You are a washed-up old electrician who got lucky, and you are about to find out what happens when your luck runs out." Vera's jaw set hard. She held out her hand. I gave her the tablet. She studied the footage for a moment and gave it back. "He's going to wake the Hendersons." She said, "Our neighbors 3 doors down, a couple in their 70s, both retired, the same people who showed up with a casserole the week Vera came home from her knee surgery 2 years back. The Hendersons are probably staring at their ceiling right now," I said. I confirmed on the app that the commercial-grade system was actively pushing both video and audio to the cloud time-stamped. Every word Derek was hurling into that October night was on record in high definition. I clipped the segment and sent it straight to Elliot Vance with 4 words: "Restraining order tonight, please." Vera placed her hand on my forearm. Not from fear, I knew the difference. When she touched me out of fear, it had a different quality entirely. This was her way of telling me she was alongside me. This was the second kind. "Remember the summer she turned 14, Vera said quietly, eyes tracking Derek below on the porch. "She slipped out for that concert with the Briggs girl. You sat on the porch until 3 in the morning. I remembered every minute of it, angry and terrified in roughly equal proportions. When Renata's car nosed into the driveway at 2:45, I'd gone down those steps with crossed arms and a hammering pulse. She'd seen my face, and the tears came before she could say a word. I held my ground for about 4 seconds before I wrapped both arms around her, longer than either of us would ever bring up again. None of that came out of my mouth right now. The memory just pressed into my chest and stayed there. Down below, Derek's approach had changed. The threats had drained out, and what replaced them was something cracked and desperate. The voice of someone who has looked down and finally understood there's nothing under him. "You cannot do this to me," he said, and the crack in his voice was real. "I have a career. I have a reputation. People know my name in this city. If this goes on my record, that's it. I am done. You are ending me over a bedroom, over a stupid room." Renata moved up beside him on the porch and got hold of his arm. "Derek, stop!" she said under her breath. "You are making everything worse. The neighbors." "I do not care about the neighbors," he snapped, yanking free. "Well, I do." She came right back, 22 minutes in by the tablet clock. Derek seized Renata by the arm and dragged her toward the leased SUV sitting at the curb. He revved the engine hard enough to split the quiet of the neighborhood wide open, then tore away, leaving twin black streaks burned into my driveway. The porch light went dark. The street settled back into silence. Vera exhaled slowly at my side. "He's going to come back," she said. "Not tonight, but he'll come back with something worse next time." "I know," I said. I set the tablet on the nightstand and eased back against the pillow. He's out of easy moves. That means whatever's coming next is going to be ugly. Vera went quiet for a moment. Beyond the window, the surface of Lake Wiley had been swallowed entirely by the dark, but I knew it was out there flat and still holding its breath until morning, Jean Vera said. "Yeah, and whatever he throws at us next." She said, "We'll be ready for it." I reached over and found her hand in the darkness. "We've been ready for it for 45 years, I said. Elliot Vance arrived at precisely 8:00 in the morning, which didn't surprise me in the least. Over 17 years of working together, the man had never once been late, and he had never once walked through a door without the work already done. He guided his silver sedan into my driveway, stepped out in a charcoal suit that looked freshly pressed within the hour, and came to the front door carrying a leather briefcase that I happened to know contained a portable scanner, 3 encrypted hard drives, and enough legal firepower to make a federal judge sit up and take notice. Vera had coffee waiting. She placed a mug in front of Elliot the moment he settled at the kitchen table, and he accepted it with a nod and moved straight to the briefcase without wasting time on pleasantries. That was one of the things I had always valued most about Elliot Vance. He didn't perform warmth, he didn't feel. He kept his energy where it belonged on the work, and the work was always exceptional. He pushed a manila folder across the table toward me. Your son-in-law is not a real estate professional in any meaningful sense of the word, Elliot said, wrapping both hands around the coffee mug. He holds a license technically, but he hasn't closed a legitimate transaction in 14 months. What he's been doing instead is running a string of increasingly desperate investment schemes, collecting fees from clients for properties he never actually controlled, and using incoming money from new clients to paper over the holes left by the ones before them. He paused. In federal terms, that's wire fraud. I opened the folder. The first document was the foreclosure notice Vera had already described, stamped in red across the top, in language that left no room for doubt. Summit Financial Group was seizing the downtown Greenville condominium. The process had been set in motion 4 months ago and was closing in on its final stage. They've been behind on that mortgage for 6 months, Elliot continued. The condo was purchased 3 years ago for $1.1 million on an adjustable rate mortgage. When the rate adjusted, Derek's payments climbed by $2,200 a month. He couldn't cover it. He paused again. And he told Renata it was a renovation. Elliot confirmed that Derek had told Renata it was a renovation. He also told her the renovation was being funded by a bonus from a major commercial deal he closed in the spring. That deal doesn't exist. Vera set her mug down on the table with a sound just slightly harder than it needed to be. The IRS situation is separate and considerably worse, Elliot said, turning to the next document. Derek has been filing fraudulent returns for at least 4 years. He overstated income in years, where that helped him secure financing, and understated it in years where he owed. He's carrying $1.4 million in back taxes, penalties, and compounding interest. His personal accounts were frozen by federal mandates 6 weeks ago. I turned to the next page, then the next. He has no liquid assets, Elliot said. The car is leased. The furniture in the condo is financed. The suits, the watch, the restaurant tabs, the vacation they posted about in July, all of it has been running on credit cards that are now at or past their limits. He held my gaze steadily across the table. When Derek walked into your house yesterday afternoon and demanded your bedroom, he had approximately $400 in an account that wasn't frozen. That is what he had. The kitchen fell completely silent, except for a jay somewhere beyond the window, loud, insistent, entirely indifferent to everything unfolding inside this house. He planned this. I said it as a statement, not a question. 8 months ago, someone using Derek's personal email address had requested a title search and property valuation on this address. Elliot said it was paid for with a personal card. He had the transaction records. He slid another sheet across the table. Derek had known exactly what this property was worth before he ever set foot inside it yesterday. He needed an asset he could leverage or liquidate fast enough to settle the IRS debt and stay ahead of criminal prosecution. This house was his plan. Vera pushed back from the table and rose. She walked to the kitchen window and stood with her back to us, both palms pressed flat on the counter looking out at the lake. Her shoulders were rigid and her breathing was measured in that deliberate way that told me she was holding something large and difficult from breaking through all at once. Renata, she said quietly without turning. Did she know the full extent of it? I can't say with certainty, Elliot answered carefully. What I can say is that she had access to the same joint accounts Derek did. She would have seen the balances. She would have seen the overdraft notices. Vera turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the skin around them was drawn tight. She knew they were in trouble, she said. Maybe not every detail, but she knew. Elliot nodded once. I looked down at the stack of documents spread in front of me. 42 years of crawling through ceilings and threading wire through conduit in the freezing dark. 42 years of 6 a.m. alarms and 12-hour days coming home, carrying the smell of industrial buildings on my skin, while Derek Schofield was shaking my hand at holiday dinners and wiping his palm on a napkin the moment I let go. He had been measuring up my house for 8 months, the way a man sizes up a building before he takes it. What do we do? I asked. Elliot reached into the briefcase and produced a second folder, thinner than the first. He set it on top of the financial documents and tapped it once with a single finger. We let him make the next move, Elliot said, because he will make one. A man in his position doesn't walk away from last night and call it finished. He's going to come at you again, And when he does, I want to be positioned to respond in a way that is permanent. He looked at me directly. Gene, I need you to trust the process and resist any urge to confront him yourself. Can you do that? I've been patient for 45 years, I said. I can hold on a few more days. Elliot almost smiled. It was the closest thing to one I had ever seen from him. He was reaching for the briefcase when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and something in his expression shifted. He answered, listened for about 15 seconds, then looked up at me with eyes that had gone several degrees cooler. That was the chief of police, Elliot said. He needs to speak with you this morning in person. Chief Leonard Falk had known me for 16 years. We'd first met at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in 2008, back when I was still running active job sites, and he was a newly promoted captain with a handshake that meant something. We had served together on the same neighborhood safety board for 4 years. His wife had made Vera's recipe for lemon pound cake every Christmas, ever since Vera passed it along to her at a block party in 2014, and she always sent over a loaf wrapped in foil with a card that read, "Thank you for the original." When he knocked on my front door at 9:30 that morning, he was not wearing his usual easy expression. He stood with his hat in his hands. His weight shifted back just slightly, the posture of a man carrying information he'd been asked to deliver and found personally uncomfortable. I opened the door and looked at him. "Leonard," I said. "Gene." He glanced past my shoulder at Elliot, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee mug and his briefcase, and something in the chief's expression shifted, recalibrating quietly. "I need a few minutes." "Come in," I said. We sat at the kitchen table. Vera poured the chief a cup of coffee without being asked, the kind of thing she did without thinking, and he accepted it with both hands and set it down without drinking. Renata came into the precinct first thing this morning. He began, his voice careful, measured the voice of a man choosing each word before he let it go. She went to the magistrate on duty and put her name on a sworn statement. "Gene, she's telling the court you have advanced dementia." He paused, eyes on mine, making certain his words were landing. "According to what she filed, you've been gripped by severe paranoia and confusion for months now. The cut on your face. Her version says you did it yourself, threw your body into that chair on purpose so you could pin a false assault charge on Derek. Nobody moved in that kitchen." Vera let out a sound, small, involuntary, the kind that escapes when something sharp catches you without warning. Her palm flew up over her mouth, stayed there 2 full seconds, then came down again. Her jaw was locked. Her eyes were lit. "She is going to the state for emergency guardianship." Chief Falk's voice fell as he pressed on. "Rights over your body, your home, and every asset you have. The filing argues you can no longer be trusted to run your own life, that left unchecked, you're a threat to yourself and the people around you." He let out a slow breath. "I have a legal obligation to bring this to you, Gene. What I want you to know is that nothing brought me to your door this morning except friendship. Not one word of that petition rings true to me." I held Chief Falk's gaze for a long beat. Then I turned to Vera. The burning in her eyes had cooled into something harder, a focused, icy resolve I hadn't seen in her for a long time. Then I turned to Elliot, who had already put his mug aside and was working the latch on the briefcase. "Leonard." Elliot's voice had taken on that particular quality, the one that arrived when he fully stepped into his professional skin. A measured, immovable. "I'm Elliot Vance, attorney of record for Mr. Harlow. Before we go a step further, there's something I'd like you to look at." He drew a document from the case and laid it in front of the chief. "What you're holding is a full cognitive and neurological workup completed by Dr. Sandra Dietrich at Bon Secours St. Francis 26 days ago. It was done as part of Gene's annual life insurance renewal physical. Dr. Dietrich carries board certification in neurology and has been practicing in Greenville for 21 years. Elliot placed one finger on the page. Gene's scores landed in the 91st percentile for his age group. Memory, executive function, processing speed. The doctor's own language was, quote, "remarkable for a man of any age." Chief Falk lifted the document and worked through it page by page. The tension drained from his face as he read visible, unguarded relief. Vera straightened in her chair and spoke, her voice pitched low and sharp enough that the chief raised his head at once. "Leonard, I have been beside this man for 45 years, she said. 45 years of breakfast across the same table every single morning. I know the way his mind moves. If Eugene Harlow's mind were slipping, I'd have seen it long before any doctor gave it a label. What Renata put on paper this morning has nothing to do with worry over her father. Vera's voice went quieter and colder. It's a financial assault with a sympathy costume on, and that distinction matters. Chief Falk set the pages down and looked at Vera. The way you look at someone who just cut through a knot everyone else was still staring at. "I hear you, Vera," he said, his voice dropping to almost nothing. He took his hat off the table and rose. He shook Elliot's hand and then mine, and when he gripped mine, he held on a beat longer than needed. "That petition won't survive contact with this evaluation," he said with a nod toward the medical file. "The magistrate will have a copy in hand before noon." He fixed me with one last look before stepping toward the door. "Jean, stay sharp. They're not done." "I know," I said. The front door shut, and the three of us remained at the table, in that specific silence that only comes after bad news has been delivered, and walked out. Vera got up and crossed to the kitchen window, eyes on the lake. Her spine was straight, her arms resting loose at her sides, nothing clenched. From the line of her shoulders I could read what I already knew. The tears she'd been refusing since the night before were still being held at bay. "She used that word," Vera said barely loud enough to hear. "Dementia." She stood in that magistrate's office and signed her name to paper, saying her father threw himself into a chair. She turned, slow. Her eyes were dry, and they were the most devastating thing in the room. Jean, that wasn't panic talking. She didn't blurt it out. She sat with that idea, turned it over, and chose it. Nothing I could say would have touched that. There was no answer that made the weight of it any lighter. My phone buzzed against the table. I flipped it over. The name on the screen was the last one I would have guessed I'd see that afternoon. 3 days after Chief Falk sat across from me and delivered the news that my daughter had stood before a magistrate and sworn I was losing my mind. On a Thursday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I checked the security feed on my phone before I got out of the armchair. Renata was on the front porch by herself. No Derek beside her, no lawyer hovering behind her. Just my daughter in a plain gray sweater and dark jeans hair gathered back in a loose knot, her face stripped of the careful layer of makeup she usually wore like a shield. She looked reduced somehow, younger and more exhausted and less than herself, the way a person looks after months of carrying weight they haven't told a soul about. She had a glass baking dish in both hands sealed with aluminum foil. I put the phone down and walked to the door. The moment it swung open, her eyes went to the bandage on my cheek and something in her face broke apart. Her chin shook, her shoulders folded inward, and she bit down on her lips in that way that says, a person is right at the edge and barely holding. "Dad," she said, and that single syllable came out in pieces. "Dad, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I lost my mind. I was scared and overwhelmed, and I let Derek push me into things I never should have gone along with. And I know that is not an excuse. I know it isn't. But I need you to know I am sorry for every single thing that happened in this house." The tears came freely then down her face, no attempt to stop them, her breathing jagged and shallow. I moved aside from the door. She came in. She went directly to the kitchen and put the dish down on the counter with both hands needing the task of it. She pulled back the foil. The smell reached me before I had time to think about it. Heat and sweetness layered together, brown sugar, cinnamon, and underneath those something earthier, a thread of nutmeg I could have named with my eyes closed. It was Vera's peach cobbler. Unmistakably, the lattice crust had turned that perfect deep gold at the edges, the fruit filling, pushing up and bubbling through the gaps, and the smell of it filled every corner of that kitchen like a memory given weight. Vera stepped into the doorway behind me. Her eyes went to the dish, then to Renata, still, watchful, reading the room the way she always did before deciding what to do with what she found. "I was up all night thinking about Mom," Renata said, pressing the back of her hand across her face. She looked between us, eyes swollen and red. "I couldn't stop picturing how she'd make this every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every time you walked in the door, after a long stretch away, Dad. And then I started thinking about how she'd feel, seeing all of this, seeing what I did, what we did, and I couldn't make myself stop crying." She reached into her bag and pulled out a document, folded once, and laid it on the table with a hand that trembled just enough to notice. "I printed this up. It's a family reconciliation agreement. Derek has agreed to anger management. He is deeply ashamed. All this does is put on record that we've reached a private resolution and that you're asking for the charges to be withdrawn. Sign it, and we leave all of this behind us. We get to be a family again." I looked at the paper, then at Renata. Then at Vera, standing in the doorway, her eyes giving me nothing I didn't already know, and everything I needed at the same time. I moved to the table. I fished my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and made a small production of rubbing the lenses clean on the hem of my flannel shirt before settling them on my face. Then I bent over the document and studied it with the slow, squinting deliberateness of a man who has to work a little harder to see than he once did. What I'm about to share next is the moment I understood how far things had truly gone and how much had been arranged without my knowledge in the dark by people I had loved without question. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you for months, would you confront them directly, or would you pull back and let the evidence do the talking? My vision was perfectly sharp. I took in every word on that page in under 45 seconds flat. The formatting was familiar the instant I saw it. The cover sheet announced a family reconciliation and settlement agreement. What was tucked beneath it was a durable financial power of attorney, handing Renata unrestricted control over every account, every portfolio, and every piece of real property attached to my name. She hadn't come here to make peace. She'd come here to finish the job Derek couldn't. I straightened up slowly and let out a long, heavy sigh, the kind that carries the full weight of a worn-out old man who has finally decided he's too tired to keep fighting. "You're right, sweetheart," I said, letting my voice come out soft and just a touch unsteady. "Your mother would hate seeing this. I just want some peace." I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a pen. It was a black ballpoint I'd picked up 2 years back from a novelty shop in Highlands as a gag gift for one of my job foremen, a man named Hector, who had a habit of borrowing pens and never returning them. The ink looked completely normal when it touched paper. The chemistry of it caused the marks to evaporate entirely within 2 hours of air exposure, leaving behind no trace, no indentation, nothing at all. I clicked the pen. I put the tip to the signature line. My hand trembled a little, not something I was proud of performing, but something the moment absolutely required. And I wrote out my full legal name, Eugene Dale Harlow, in slow and deliberate cursive across the bottom of that fraudulent document. The instant the last letter was finished, the room shifted. Renata's tears switched off, not slowly, instantly. Whatever grief had been on her face drained away clean, replaced by something businesslike and efficient. She reached across the table and lifted the document before my pen had fully left the page, folded it in 2 crisp movements, and dropped it into her bag. She didn't thank me. She didn't embrace me. She turned and walked out of the kitchen through the living room and straight out the front door without a single backward glance. Vera and I stood listening to the sound of her car turning over and pulling away down the street. Vera moved to the counter. She looked down at the peach cobbler, her lips pressed together in a hard, flat line. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and controlled and precise. "She used the nutmeg," Vera said. "Jean, I never wrote that down. I showed her one time right here in this kitchen when she was 9 years old and standing on a step stool." She looked up at me, and her eyes were lit with something that was grief and fury in equal measure. "She used her mother's recipe to work her father over. She turned this cobbler into a weapon." I pulled Vera close with an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me for exactly 3 seconds, warm and steady and real. Then she pulled herself upright, swept the back of her wrist across her eyes, and fixed me with a clear, level look. "Is the signature gone?" she asked. "In about 2 hours," I said. "There'll be nothing on that line. Nothing at all." I wasn't inside First Piedmont Bank that afternoon. I was out on the back porch with a mug of black tea and what was left of the October light skating off the surface of the lake, watching a pair of geese making their slow crossing along the far bank. But Elliot called me 40 minutes after Renata left my kitchen and walked me through all of it. And 2 days on, when the bank turned over the security footage as part of the formal fraud documentation, I watched it myself on my laptop at the kitchen table while Vera stood behind me with her hand resting on my shoulder. So I can lay it out for you exactly as it happened. Derek and Renata entered First Piedmont Bank at 4:17 in the afternoon. Derek had on a fresh suit, navy blue, the kind that reads well on camera, and he came in with shoulders squared and chin lifted, wearing the posture of a man who expects the room to recognize him as someone who does not wait in lines. Renata was at his side in a wool coat, her bag pressed tight against her body, her jaw carrying that particular set of someone who has made a decision and is forbidding themselves from examining it too closely. They skipped the teller line entirely and went straight to the private banking desk. The associate asked whether they had an appointment. Derek said they didn't need one. He requested the branch manager by name, which told me he'd done his homework, and he described the matter as urgent and time-sensitive. 2 words Derek deployed the way other men use crowbars on things that were never meant to open. Calvin Ashford stepped out of his office 2 minutes later. Calvin was 42 years old, lean and exact, in a charcoal suit, with a pocket square that matched his tie with the precision of someone who leaves nothing to chance. He had the kind of steady measuring eyes that come from spending 20 years watching people try to move money in directions it wasn't meant to go. He shook Derek's hand, shook Renata's hand, and showed them both into his private office, without his expression changing by a degree. What Derek didn't know and had never thought to find out, because men like Derek don't bother learning anything about the people they consider beneath them, was the history between Calvin Ashford and the retired electrician whose life savings he was attempting to take. 18 years earlier, Calvin was a 24-year-old midway through his second year at USC upstate, keeping himself afloat on student loans and a part-time shift at a building supply warehouse on the east side of town. His mother had just been cut loose from the textile plant, where she'd put in 19 years. Fault didn't enter into it. The outcome was the same either way. Calvin was going to have to walk away from school. I used to come through that warehouse 2 or 3 times a week for commercial materials. I'd seen Calvin at the register more times than I could count always, with a textbook cracked open beside the cash drawer, always reading between customers. One evening in February, I found him in the back aisle, sitting on a pallet of drywall, with his face buried in his hands. I asked him what had happened. He told me. I drove home that night and talked it over with Vera for 20 minutes. The next morning, I came back with a certified check drawn on my company account for $40,000. Enough to cover his remaining tuition, his books, and a decent place to live for the next 2 years. Calvin tried to turn it down. His voice was unsteady, and his eyes were wet, and he kept saying he couldn't take it, that he would pay it back, that he had to pay it back. I told him the only thing I wanted was for him to finish his degree, get himself into a position where he could look out for people, and make sure nobody ever stripped something away from someone who didn't know how to defend themselves. He had done exactly that. He'd climbed through the ranks at First Piedmont Bank with a steady, methodical purpose I found myself admiring every time I caught his name on my quarterly statements. He knew my accounts. He knew my trusts. He understood the full scope of what Eugene Harlow had spent 42 years building, and the loyalty he carried toward me was quiet and absolute, and had never once been put to the test until that afternoon. Derek settled into the chair across from Calvin and didn't waste time on formalities. We need a cashier's check for $200,000 drawn from Eugene Harlow's primary savings account, he said, setting the folded document on Calvin's desk and nudging it forward with 2 fingers. My father-in-law has given us complete financial authority over his estate. The paperwork is right there in front of you. We're working against a deadline, and we need this handled today. Calvin picked up the document. He opened it with care and smoothed it flat against the desktop with both hands. He read the header, he read the body. He came to the signature line at the bottom and studied it for a long, unhurried moment. Then he turned the document back around and slid it across the desk toward Derek. I apologize for the inconvenience, Calvin said, his voice entirely level and professional. But I'm not able to process this authorization. The signature line on this document is completely blank. Derek's composure cracked just slightly. That is impossible, he said. I wasn't there, but my wife watched her father sign that document this afternoon in his own kitchen with his own pen. I understand, Calvin said, his tone pleasant and unmoved. Nevertheless, there is no signature present on this line. A power of attorney without a valid signature is not a legally executable document under South Carolina law. I cannot authorize a withdrawal of this size on the basis of an unsigned instrument. Renata snatched the document from Derek's side of the desk and stared at the bottom of the page. The color left her face entirely. She flipped it over. She held it up toward the office light. She dragged her thumbnail across the signature line, as though the ink might be concealed beneath some invisible layer. He signed it, she said, her voice climbing. I was standing right there. I watched him take the pen and write his name. I saw the ink on the page. Calvin said, the line is blank. Derek came out of his chair so fast it shot backward and struck the wall behind him. He drove both palms flat onto Calvin's desk and pushed his face to within roughly 14 inches of Calvin's, which didn't move at all. You did something to it. Derek said, his voice dropping into something low and ugly. You treated the desk, or you swapped the document. You're running interference for that old man, and I want to know who told you to stick your nose into a legal financial transaction. Calvin leaned back in his chair by a fraction and moved one hand beneath the edge of the desk. Mr. Schofield, he said, his tone shifting from pleasant to something considerably more firm. Attempting to execute an unsigned legal instrument against a senior citizen's accounts is something I am obligated to report. Adding a threat against a bank officer in the process makes it considerably worse. He pressed the button below the desk. I'll ask you both to stay where you are. The magnetic locks on the main doors engaged with a sound like a vault seating home. The security display above the teller stations went red. 2 guards took up positions in front of the office door. Renata swung toward the glass wall, saw the guards, and produced a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, high and frightened and completely real. Derek's hands were trembling against the desktop. I was on my back porch when Elliot called to tell me it was finished. The geese were still moving along the far side of the lake. The coffee had cooled in my hand. I looked out at the water and felt something settle quietly into place deep inside my chest, the way a heavy door sounds when it finally closes, flush with the frame. I had noticed the car the night before, a silver sedan sitting 2 houses down on the opposite side of the street. Engine off, no lights running. In my neighborhood on a Wednesday evening in October, that vehicle didn't belong there. I logged the plate number on my phone and sent it to Elliot before I turned in. By morning, the car was still sitting in the same spot. I was on my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang at 9:45. I pulled up the security camera on my tablet before I moved. A man I didn't know was on the front porch in a charcoal blazer, a clipboard tucked under his arm, wearing the look of practiced authority I'd seen before on building inspectors and a certain breed of salesman, the look that says, I have every right to be here, and you'll find it easier not to push back. Derek's car was visible in the front camera's rear view, parked at the far end of my block. I told Vera quietly, who was standing at the door, and what I believed was unfolding. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Then she went to the kitchen drawer, opened it, and handed me the small digital recorder I had put there 2 nights before in anticipation of precisely this kind of visit. South Carolina is a one-party consent state, meaning I was entirely within my legal rights to record any conversation I took part in without disclosing it to the other party. I pressed the record button before I opened the door. The man on the porch was around 50, silver hair, combed back from a wide forehead, with the slightly overgroomed appearance of someone who invested more effort in how he looked than in what he actually was. He raised the clipboard to show me a printed form bearing what appeared to be an official county seal. Mr. Harlow, he said, his voice carrying the flat, impersonal authority of bureaucracy. My name is Dr. Philip Dunning. I'm here on behalf of the Greenville County Adult Protective Services Division to conduct a state-mandated cognitive wellness evaluation. Your family has filed a formal concern about your capacity to safely manage your own affairs. I am legally required to complete this assessment today. If you decline to cooperate, I am authorized to contact the county to initiate an involuntary evaluation hold. He was not from Greenville County Adult Protective Services. Elliot had already confirmed that no such visit had been scheduled or authorized by any county agency. The seal on his clipboard was a well-made copy, but a copy all the same. Dr. Philip Dunning was a formerly licensed psychiatrist whose medical credentials had been suspended in Georgia 3 years ago following a complaint involving falsified patient documentation. Derek had located him in whatever corner of the internet is reserved for people willing to do fraudulent work in exchange for cash. I said none of this. I stepped back from the door and waved him inside, moving slowly, keeping my face soft and mildly uncertain, the expression of a man who finds unexpected visitors a little hard to process. Vera appeared briefly in the kitchen's doorway, looked at Dunning with the same expression she reserved for contractors who showed up without calling, first then withdrew without a word. I heard her move quietly to the far end of the house. Dunning settled himself at the kitchen table with the ease of a man accustomed to owning whatever room he walked into. He unpacked his clipboard with theatrical care, laying out several printed assessment forms, and a pen bearing a small university logo on the clip that I was fairly certain he had sourced specifically for occasions like this one. His eyes traveled slowly around my kitchen, across the worn work boots by the back door, the faded flannel jacket hanging on the hook, the plain mugs lined up on the counter. I watched his posture shift in small but readable ways, relaxing into something more comfortable and dismissive. He had already made up his mind about what I was. Mr. Harlow, he said, speaking at a pace noticeably slower than ordinary conversation, each word shaped with the deliberate enunciation people use with small children and the very old. I want you to know this evaluation is completely routine, nothing to be anxious about. We're simply going to have a conversation, and I'll ask you a few straightforward questions. Is that all right? Of course, I said. I let my voice come out a little thin, the voice of a man who wears out easily. Can you tell me today's date? I furrowed my brow and looked toward the window. It's a Thursday, I said slowly. October, I believe. I paused. 2013. Dunning wrote something on his form. And can you tell me who the current president of the United States is? I gave him a name that hadn't been accurate for over a decade, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had no idea he was wrong. More writing. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I started correctly, then stopped at 86, pressed my fingers to my temple, and said my head was hurting, and I couldn't remember what came next. Dunning nodded, with an expression of enormous, barely contained satisfaction, the expression of a man collecting exactly what he had been paid to find. He eased back in his chair and let his professional composure slip just enough. He shook his head slowly and made a small sound under his breath that might have been a laugh. Derek told me exactly what to expect, he said almost to himself, clicking his pen against the clipboard. You are completely gone, friend. You don't even know what year it is. This is going to be the most straightforward $10,000 I have made in a very long time. The kitchen was perfectly still. The digital recorder tucked beneath the table's lip was capturing every syllable in high fidelity. I kept my eyes on the tabletop and held my expression vague and empty and thoroughly vacant, while somewhere inside my chest, something cold and precise clicked into place, like the final tumbler of a lock finding its seat. Dunning closed his folder, got to his feet, smoothed his blazer, and told me he'd be filing his report with the appropriate state agencies immediately, and that I should expect contact within 72 hours regarding placement in a suitable care facility. He let himself out. I listened to his footsteps cross the porch and go down the front steps. The moment the door clicked shut, I sat up straight. I reached under the table, took out the recorder, and stopped it. I carried it to my desk, transferred the audio file to my laptop, attached it to an encrypted message, and sent it directly to Elliot Vance. My note was 4 words: add bribery. Use everything. Vera appeared in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, eyes sharp. Did you get it? She caught every word. He'd named Derek out loud, named the dollar amount, said it right there in my kitchen. Vera exhaled through her nose. Good. The word came out flat and final, weighted with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had held herself in check for a long time and was now watching that restraint collect its return. Then let Elliot finish it. The file hit my desktop at 11:43 in the morning, routed through Elliot's encrypted server to the small office off the hallway, the room where I had handled contracts and business correspondence for the better part of 20 years. The air in there carried the smell of old paper and the machine oil that sweated out of the portable heater in the corner. The window faced the side yard, where the oak I'd put in the ground the year we moved to this house had climbed high enough that the glass sat in shadow well before noon. I pulled up the file. Elliot had left a note at the top 3 lines, which was more than he typically bothered with. The Dunning recording is clean and will go in as evidence of criminal bribery and conspiracy to commit fraud. What comes after is the part that matters more. Take your time with it before you decide anything. I took my time. Derek had been moving money, not the balances sitting in his frozen domestic accounts, which were already picked clean, but a separate trail of wire transfers that Elliot's forensic accountant had pulled up through a mix of financial surveillance and subpoenaed banking records. Over the past 6 weeks, Derek had been threading funds through transactions dressed up to look like ordinary business costs, until the money settled into 2 freshly formed shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. The numbers weren't headline level together. They came to just under $300,000, but where the money was going was entirely outside the law. The trail had been deliberately obfuscated, and the motive was transparent to anyone who understood how badly Derek's position had deteriorated. He was securing a way out before the walls closed in. The next page was where my stomach fell. Derek hadn't registered those Cayman accounts under his own name. He'd used Renata's. Her digital signature appeared on the founding documents, forged most likely from paperwork he'd lifted out of their joint banking records. Her name sat as primary account holder across both shell corporations. Her social security number appeared on every tax identification filing. Legally, once federal investigators traced those transfers, and the file made no mystery of the fact that Renata would look like the person who built the whole operation. Derek was positioning my daughter to absorb the fall. I stayed in that office chair a long time after I finished reading. Outside the window, the oak shifted in a slow breeze, the few leaves still hanging on, catching the thin October light and going copper. Down the hall, I could hear Vera in the kitchen, the low drift of the radio she liked to keep on, while she worked one of those stations that runs old country from the 70s and 80s. I thought about the night Renata came into the world 40 years ago in a delivery room at Presbyterian Hospital. The first time I held her, she was 40 minutes old. I made a promise to her right then that I never put words to for anyone, not even Vera. It was simple. I would not let anything damage her if I could get between her and it. I would keep holding that line as long as I had the ability to stand. She had made that promise very hard to honor lately. But Derek putting her name on offshore accounts wasn't something she'd done. It was something inflicted on her by a man who had quietly decided that his own escape was worth the cost of destroying hers. He was prepared to leave my daughter exposed to federal wire fraud charges, federal money laundering charges, and the very real prospect of prison to purchase himself a few extra months and a few $100,000. I pushed back from the desk and walked down to the kitchen. Vera was at the stove. She heard me in the doorway and turned around, and she read what was on my face the way she had always read it, with the precision that comes from 45 years of studying the same person. "Sit down," she said, and turned the burner to low. I sat and laid out everything the file contained. I watched what it did to her face, shock moving through, first then a sharp anger, and beneath that settling like cold sediment, the version of Vera that I knew never flinched. "He signed her name to those accounts," Vera said. "Put her on the paperwork and never told her a word." "Yes," I said. "To cover himself." "Yes." Vera looked at the wall. A beat passed. Then she turned back and her voice carried no tremor at all. "Jean, if you sit on this, she's the one who ends up in federal custody, not him. Her name is on every document." "I know," I said. There's only one road. You make certain the filing draws a clear line. She had no knowledge, she had no hand in it. You sever her from him before this thing breaks open." I sat with that. I thought about Renata 4 days ago, standing in my living room with manufactured tears running down her face and a fraudulent power of attorney tucked in her bag, turning her mother's cobbler into a weapon against a father she figured was too far gone to notice. And I thought about Derek wherever he was, right now running his numbers perfectly at ease, with the idea of watching his wife face prosecution if it bought him $300,000 of breathing room. I went back to my desk. I brought up the IRS Criminal Investigation Division whistleblower portal on my encrypted browser and put the submission package together, piece by piece, every document Elliot had sent me. Routing numbers, wire transfer logs, the Shell Corporation registration filings. And at the end, a precise and deliberately worded statement establishing that the digital signature of Renata Harlow Schofield on these accounts had been placed there without her awareness or participation, and that every decision behind these transfers had been made by Derek Schofield alone. I protected her first, then I lit the rest of it on fire. One last review of the package. Then I moved the cursor onto the submit button and left it there for exactly 3 seconds. I was thinking about a delivery room 40 years back and a promise that never needed to be spoken to be real. Protecting her didn't always take the shape she would have chosen. Sometimes it took this shape. I clicked submit. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. "Derek, what I'm about to tell you is the moment everything either fell apart or came together. Even now, I'm not entirely sure which it was." The voice coming through that phone was nothing like the man who had stood in my living room 10 days before, back straight, chin level, working his charm and his contempt, like a person who had moved through his whole life without once being refused and fully expected that to continue. This was something altogether different, rawer, less assembled. It was the voice of someone who had walked to the lip of a very long drop and was looking over the edge. "I need to see you," he said. "Today. Just the two of us, no attorneys, no Renata. Come alone, Jean. There's something I need to show you. When you see it, I think you'll want to talk." I named the location I was willing to use. He gave me an address. The place was a commercial strip on the south side of Greenville, a low building with a sun-bleached awning tucked in between a dry cleaner and a nail salon, its parking lot long overdue for new asphalt. The kind of address that rents conference space by the month to people whose ambitions have always outrun their means. I pulled my truck in between a rusted sedan and a van with a cracked windshield and sat there a moment, taking in the building. Elliot had reached me twice during the drive over. Both times I'd picked up and given him the same answer. I know what I'm doing. Trust me. I went in. Derek was already seated at the conference table, one of 3 chairs that didn't match around a veneer surface that was lifting at one corner. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. The suit on his back was the same one he'd had on the night he was arrested, and whatever care had gone into pressing it hadn't been enough. The skin beneath his eyes had gone past, tired into something that looked bruised, and his right hand carried a slight tremor. He was visibly working to keep still. The smirk was still there, though. Some things hold on even after everything else has let go. "Sit down, Gene," he said. I sat. He took out his phone, brought up a video file, and angled the screen toward me. I watched. It was footage from my own living room security system. He must have caught the access code off my phone screen the afternoon he showed up, close enough behind me in the hallway that it hadn't occurred to me to block his line of sight. I had reset every password the night he was arrested, but the code was already gone by then. He had cut the footage together with real skill. Every frame showing him and launched that oak chair had been scrubbed from the recording. What he'd left behind was a tight loop my arm coming up, then a hard cut to Renata pitching sideways over one of the designer suitcases and slamming into the wall. Strip out those 15 missing seconds, and the footage told one story, only an old man throwing his daughter across a room. Tonight at 7, this goes to WCNC, to WBTV, and to every household on your block. Derek's voice had steadied. Having something to aim at agreed with him. "I'll tell them you went after her during a dementia episode. Give it until breakfast, and everyone around Lake Wiley who's ever heard your name will know exactly the kind of man they've been dealing with." He let the air sit heavy for a beat. Unless what?" I said. A document slid across the table toward me. "Quitclaim deed. Transfers the Lake Wiley property straight to Renata and me. No trust, no conditions, no corporate wrapper of any kind. One signature, and the 2 of us disappear from your life permanently." He dropped onto his elbows, closing the distance between us. "I'm sure you've got money tucked away somewhere. Pick a retirement community. Grab a condo down in Hilton Head. Spend whatever time you've got left without all this noise. But put your name on that deed right now, or I swear to you every day of the next 30 years gets used up convincing people you didn't put your own daughter in the hospital." He eased back in his chair, laced his arms across his chest, and regarded me with the calm satisfaction of a man who figures he's just closed the argument. I studied the quitclaim deed sitting there between us. What Derek didn't know, and what his strip mall attorney had evidently not troubled himself to discover before drawing up this paperwork, was the particular legal character of the Lake Wiley property. 3 years back, acting on Vera's advice to overhaul our holdings, after a significant jump in our commercial contracts, Elliot and I had gone through federal regulators to formally designate a portion of the property as a licensed staging and transit zone for regulated industrial electrical materials, high-voltage transformer components, dielectric fluid containers, and specialized insulation compounds. My crews needed stored centrally between major job sites around the state. Every bit of it was lawful, fully permitted, and bound to my corporate entity. It was also sitting in plain public view, recorded with the county clerk and the appropriate federal agencies, findable by any attorney willing to run a standard title and zoning search before telling a client to take a direct, personal deed transfer. Derek's attorney had skipped that search entirely. The instant anyone absorbed an unshielded transfer of this property outside my corporate structure, they inherited full personal liability for each regulated substance on those grounds. Under federal environmental law, that person became a private citizen, running a commercial hazardous materials operation. No license, no insurance, no permit of any description. I hadn't arranged this strategically. It had simply been sitting there for 3 years. Derek had never once thought to check. I gave him nothing to read in my face. What I gave him instead was body language, eyes moving from the phone to the deed, to my own hands, then shoulders curving inward in the gradual, resigned way of a man running out of will to fight. If I put my name on this, I said, thinning my voice, letting a faint tremor into it. I need you to swear you'll wipe that video. I can't have Vera coming across it. Derek's hand crossed the table. He lifted the pen from beside the deed and set it in my palm, not quite forcing it there, but not gently either. Sign the deed, Jean, he said, and I'll handle everything. His attention was all on my hand, eyes nailed to the signature line with the sharpened focus of someone who has been circling a thing for a long time and can finally touch it. I put the pen to paper. My hand came down slowly, carrying a slight tremor I had rehearsed until it felt natural. I wrote out my full legal name, Eugene Dale Harlow, in the same measured cursive I'd put to 42 years of commercial contracts, and I shaped every letter to look like a man signing away the last thing he owned. The attorney notarized it on the spot, driving the stamp down with a quickness that told me it had been ready in his fist the whole meeting. What happened to Derek's face next is something I won't soon forget. 10 days of held tension, the kind that camps in a man's jaw. His brow, the corners of his eyes released all at once like a cable finally cut. His shoulders fell. He lifted the deed off the table and held it out in front of him, with both hands studying it, the way a person studies something they've committed genuine wrongs to obtain. And what moved across his features then was relief so complete it was nearly physical to watch. He got to his feet and fastened his jacket. The smirk had returned richer now, and riding on top of all that relief, it shaded into something that resembled actual happiness, which struck me as the most troubling expression I'd ever seen on him. Enjoy the rest of your life, Jean. I mean it sincerely. Find somewhere easy and let people who can manage these things take over from here. I rose, steadied myself, and left the conference room without offering him a word in return. As I passed through the door, I caught the tail end of something he said to the attorney. Both of them were still laughing when I reached the hall. The parking lot outside was bright and cold, the afternoon sun doing no work at all on the temperature. I settled into my truck and held the wheel in both hands for a moment. Across town, Vera was already installed at the lakefront estate. She'd made the move 3 days earlier, once Elliot confirmed this meeting was inevitable. The house now bearing Derek's name had stopped being mine in any structural sense, but it was nowhere close to being his, in any sense that would actually help him. I turned the key and rolled out of the lot without a backward glance. Vera and I had worked it out the morning, following Elliot's quiet, undramatic accounting of Derek's full financial position. No raised voices, no long debate, just the two of us deciding the way we'd always decided things that actually counted. She'd carried out the photographs, her mother's jewelry box, and certain things from the kitchen that traced back even further than that. The rest of it, the furniture, the fixtures, the rooms themselves, was just property. When I turned my truck onto the street I'd called home for 27 years, a white commercial van was already sitting in my driveway. The magnetic lettering on its door read, Lake Wiley Lock and Key. A man in a gray work uniform knelt at my front entrance with a drill pulling out the brass deadbolt I'd hung there myself back in 1997. Derek's leased SUV sat canted onto the grass near the front walk. He'd come straight from the strip mall, not a moment squandered on celebration, before staking his claim on what he was certain he'd won. I pulled to the curb and stayed in the truck. October light in the Carolinas has a way of going gold and level late in the afternoon. When the season is shifting, everything bathed in a warmth that carries the feeling of finality, like the last of something good. The oak out front had given up most of its leaves. They lay in drifts across the grass copper, shading into brown. I stepped out and followed the walk toward the house. Derek filled the doorway before I made it to the porch. Jacket off the quitclaim deed held in one hand with the easy grip of a document that has finished its usefulness. Past his shoulder, 2 of their designer suitcases were propped in the hallway, the same luggage that had hit my hardwood floor 10 days ago. 15 minutes, Derek said. That's what you've got. No full smile, but the muscles around his eyes had gone slack in a way they hadn't been for days. The particular looseness of a man whose most urgent problem has just been solved before the next set of problems has had time to announce itself. Take whatever you came for and clear out. Raymond's nearly finished with the hardware. At the far end of the hall, Renata stood holding her phone, her gaze fixed somewhere on the wall, not on me. Her whole body carried the stiffness of someone who is aware they're doing something wrong and has chosen not to sit with that awareness too long. "Renata," I said. She turned to look at me. Her jaw was set, her eyes pink at the edges. She'd been crying recently, but had packed it away somewhere. She couldn't reach it, at least not here. "You brought this on yourself, Dad." She said the words flat and rehearsed the tone of something practiced in the car on the drive over. If you'd been reasonable from the start, it wouldn't have had to go this way. Get your things. We have contractors here in the morning. I held my daughter in my gaze for a long moment. I thought about the step stool she used to drag to the kitchen counter when she was 9, helping Vera measure nutmeg into a mixing bowl, her tongue tucked between her teeth in concentration. I thought about the way she'd fall asleep against the truck window on the way home from job sites, those small hands curled loose in her lap, cheek flattened against the glass. Then I walked past her. My boots made their familiar sound against the hardwood, that particular solid knock that comes from 42 years of steel-toed work boots hitting every kind of floor. I climbed the stairs for the final time. In the bedroom, I dragged the old leather suitcase down from the closet shelf, the one I'd picked up in 1988 at a luggage shop in downtown Greenville that had long since been replaced by a coffee chain. I didn't pack clothes. I left the furniture, the linens, the kitchen things, the accumulated weight of 27 years in that house, all of it. What I took was the frame photograph from the dresser, the one from our 30th wedding anniversary. Vera and I on the dock at Lake Kiowee, the sun sinking behind us, both of us laughing at something I've since lost the thread of. I took the small wooden box from the nightstand where Vera kept the pearl earrings her mother had passed to her. I took the original set of lineman's pliers from my very first commercial electrical contract in 1982, still rolled in their leather sleeve, still sharp. On my way down the hall, I stopped at Renata's old bedroom. Door closed. It was always closed now. I pressed my palm flat against the wood and held it there for exactly 3 seconds. I could feel the grain beneath my hand, the particular texture of painted wood that has absorbed enough years to belong to a place. Then I lifted my hand and went back downstairs. Derek was at the bottom waiting. Before I'd cleared the last step, he reached out and pulled the leather suitcase from my grip, not to be helpful, but to relieve me of it as efficiently as he could. He walked it to the front door and set it on the porch outside in one motion, the way you set out recycling. "Have a good evening, Jean," he said. The locksmith stepped back as Derek swung the new door shut in my face. The deadbolt turned with a sound. I had no prior memory of the sound of my own house sealing itself against me, and it landed somewhere in my chest that I'm not going to try to put into words. I stood on the porch for a moment. Then I lifted my suitcase, went down the steps, and followed the concrete path out to the curb. A black SUV was sitting there, engine running, windows dark. The driver, a man in a dark suit, was out of the vehicle the moment he saw me approach. He came to where I stood, took the leather suitcase from me with both hands, and carried it to the rear of the car with a care that bore no resemblance to how the previous 10 minutes had unfolded. He opened the rear passenger door without a word. I got in. The interior was warm and hushed and smelled of clean leather. A bottle of cold sparkling water sat in the center console, and the seat shifted automatically to receive me. Vera was already there on the far side, and the moment the door closed, her hand found mine. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Through the tinted glass, I could see the front of the house. In the living room window, Derek appeared briefly with his phone raised, already on a call most likely. The warm overhead light caught him from behind. And from this distance, through this glass, he had the look of a man who believed he'd just taken something. The driver pulled away from the curb in a long, smooth arc. The house moved out of frame. Vera's hand was steady and warm in mine, and the road ahead led somewhere Derek Schofield had no knowledge of. The lakefront estate was reached by a private gravel lane that curved through a quarter-mile of hardwood before the trees opened onto the property. On still mornings, when the lake lay flat and the light came in low through the eastern tree line, the place held a quality of silence I had spent 30 years earning and had only lately let myself actually live inside. Vera was already downstairs when I came in from the morning. She'd made coffee and was out on the cedar deck in her wool robe, both hands wrapped around a mug, watching the water. The lake surface in the early light had the color of pewter, flat, motionless. A great blue heron stood in the shallows near the dock, with the patient stillness of a creature that has learned not to spend itself on things beyond its reach. I poured a cup and went out to join her. We stood there for a few minutes without anything needing to be said, and it bore no resemblance to the hollowed silence of the night before. This was something else, the easy, specific quiet of two people who have kept each other company long enough that words can be set aside without anything being lost. Elliot's text had come through at 7:14 a.m. County clerk processed the deed transfer last night. Automated federal notification triggered at midnight. EPA Regional Office Greenville received the flag at 12:04 a.m. Expect response this morning. I passed the phone to Vera. She read it, handed it back, and turned her eyes back to the water. How long before they get there? She asked. Federal agencies move faster when the paperwork is already in front of them, I said. Elliot made sure it was. She nodded and lifted her coffee. I opened the security application on my tablet and brought up the camera feeds for the Lake Wiley house. Neither Derek nor Renata had appeared yet. The front of the property looked unchanged, oak tree stripped bare driveway empty, the new deadbolt throwing a small glint of morning sun. At 8:47, a vehicle turned onto the street, a white commercial van, a green federal seal on the door panel. Then a second van, and behind that, two black government SUVs. They arranged themselves at angles across the driveway and the front lawn. The people stepping out wore high-visibility yellow vests with EPA printed in dark letters across the back. Two agents were already unspooling yellow caution tape before they'd fully cleared their doors. On the tablet screen, I watched a woman in a Navy jacket badge on her lapel metal clipboard in hand walk the front path and knock on the door with the particular knock of someone who was not asking permission to enter. Derek answered in sweatpants and a rumpled undershirt, hair uncombed. Whatever he'd been expecting to greet him on a Thursday morning at his newly acquired property, it wasn't standing on that porch. I had no audio from the exterior camera, but the body language told the story well enough. The agent spoke. Derek's face cycled through confusion, then impatience, then something that was working hard to resemble confidence without quite getting there. He crossed his arms. He said something. She answered. She extended a stack of documents toward him, and the hand that reached for them was measurably less composed than it had been half a minute earlier. Two agents moved past him into the house. He turned to track them, and the agent at the door said something further that snapped his attention right back to her. Renita materialized behind him in the doorway, bathrobe, on hair down her face, caught in that unguarded expression of fear and confusion that appears before a person has assembled themselves for the day. The two agents who had entered came back out 4 minutes later through the side door off the basement. One of them spoke into a radio. The lead agent made a note on her clipboard and turned her attention back to Derek. I had seen enough to know what they were finding. Down in that basement sat 14 sealed industrial drums of regulated high-voltage insulation, compound, and dielectric transformer fluid materials my commercial crews used on large-scale electrical infrastructure jobs. Properly stored, properly labeled, entirely legitimate. And under federal environmental law, the exclusive liability of whoever held the deed to the property above them. Derek had accepted that deed the previous afternoon in a strip mall conference room without putting a single question to anyone about what the property contained or what obligations rode with it. His attorney had skipped the zoning search, never requested a property disclosure, never consulted the county environmental registry, where my basement's registered commercial use had been publicly documented for 3 years. My phone rang. I checked the screen. Derek. I answered and put it on speaker so Vera could hear. You set me up. Gone was any trace of the voice he used for negotiating, for intimidating, for any of the registers I'd heard him work over the years. What was left was stripped bare genuine panic, high and fast and barely leashed. You handed me a house with federal chemicals sitting in the basement. You knew about this. You deliberately said nothing. Good morning, Derek, I said. Do not good morning me. His breathing was audible. There are EPA agents on my lawn. They're telling me I'm personally liable for storing regulated materials on an unlicensed commercial site. They're talking about a fine of nearly $2 million. You need to call them off. Call Elliot and reverse the deed transfer right now. I looked out at the lake. The heron hadn't moved. The environmental status of that property has been on file with the county and the relevant federal agencies for 3 years, I said. Public record, any attorney running a standard title search before advising a client to take a direct property transfer would have turned it up inside an hour. You knew I wouldn't look. You brought your own attorney, Derek. You picked the location. You drafted the document. You pressed the pen into my hand. I let a beat pass. I simply gave you exactly what you demanded. A sound came through the line that wasn't quite a word, something between a groan and a gasp. Reverse the deed, he said. And now the panic had curdled into something approaching desperation, a register I hadn't anticipated from him and found when I heard it that I felt nothing about at all. I'll delete the video. I'll go to the police and tell them I made up the assault allegation. I'll put my name on whatever you need. Just take the property back, please." "You should speak with an attorney," I said. "A better one this time." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the patio table. Vera looked at me. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It was something more considered, more worn, more final. "Is it over?" she asked. "This part," I said. She turned back to the lake. The heron spread its wings, pushed off from the shallows with 2 heavy strokes, and climbed in a long, slow arc across the water until it cleared the tree line on the far shore and was gone. Vera watched until it disappeared. "He's going to come here," she said quietly. "Once he works out that the phone isn't going to fix this, he'll get in that car." I reached for my tablet and opened the security interface for the estate. The system was already live. Everything was already running. "I know," I said. "Let him come." I heard him before I saw him. The sound reached me through the estate walls at 7:18 in the evening, a hard metallic impact, then the sustained shriek of stressed iron, the sound of a 2-ton vehicle meeting a gate that was not built to be driven through. I was in the second-floor study reviewing a contract amendment Elliot had forwarded, and that sound had me out of the chair and at the window in under 3 seconds. The leased SUV had struck the wrought iron entry gate at what I put at 30 miles an hour. The front end was crumpled. The left headlight was gone. The gate itself had been knocked half off its upper hinge and hung open at a sharp, violent angle. Derek was already clear of the vehicle covering ground, fast across the gravel toward the front entrance. In his right hand, he carried a steel crowbar that caught the beam of the motion sensor lights as he moved. Renata climbed out of the passenger side more slowly. She stood on the gravel in her coat, both hands pressed flat to the sides of her face, mouth open watching her husband close on the house with the crowbar raised. I moved to the security panel on the wall and opened the master control interface on my tablet. The estate's security system was not residential grade. I had designed it myself, drawing on 20 years spent routing commercial electrical infrastructure through high-security facilities, federal buildings, and pharmaceutical research campuses. The perimeter cameras were military spec. The ground floor window glass was ballistic polymer, 2 inches thick, rated for sustained impact. The interior ran a concealed alert system tied directly to the Greenville County Police Department dispatch on a priority channel. I had left the front gate on standard hinges on purpose precisely because I needed Derek to be able to breach it if he chose to. I needed him inside this property. I needed him to make this decision somewhere every second of it would be captured, witnessed, and beyond dispute. The first crowbar swing hit the front entrance glass and produced a crack like a gunshot. The ballistic polymer held, fracturing into a white spiderweb, but it didn't give. Derek swung again harder. His face twisted into something I didn't recognize as the man who used to sit at my holiday table making jokes about my work boots. A third swing, and the frame around the glass surrendered before the glass itself did. He stepped through into the foyer. I pressed the activation icon on the tablet. The response was immediate and absolute. A 130-decibel commercial security siren erupted from speakers concealed in the ceiling of every ground floor room, a sound calibrated specifically to produce physical disorientation in an enclosed space. The recessed lighting dropped into a rapid white strobe, turning the interior into a churning chaos of light and shadow. From the tracks above every ground floor window and exterior doorway, solid steel security shutters descended on motorized rails and locked into floor receivers with a synchronized impact that rattled the floorboards. The front entrance sealed behind Derek before he had taken 4 steps into the foyer. He dropped the crowbar instantly, both hands flying to his ears, staggering sideways into the entry table. A ceramic piece Vera and I had brought back from a trip to Highlands 12 years ago hit the floor and broke apart. Derek bent forward, the strobe robbing him of any fixed point to orient himself against and finding none. I walked to the interior balcony on the 2nd floor and looked down through the floor-to-ceiling ballistic glass panel enclosing the railing. The full foyer was laid out below me. Derek was on his knees, hands clamped over his ears, face locked in pain and panic, and in the particular terror of a man who has just understood that the space he walked into is entirely hostile and offers him no exit. He looked up. He found me on the 2nd floor, standing behind the glass arms at my sides, looking down at him. I was wearing the flannel shirt Renata had knitted for me when she was 12 years old. I had put it on that morning, without thinking, and had not taken it off. Derek's mouth moved, but the siren swallowed whatever he said. His expression moved through rage, then bewilderment, then settled somewhere in the range of raw, unmediated fear, the fear of a man who has exhausted his options and knows it. Outside on the exterior camera feed on my tablet, I watched Renata on the gravel. She had drifted away from the ruined SUV and was standing at the edge of the motion sensor light's reach, hands still at her face, no longer watching the house. Her eyes had turned toward the road. Then the lights came, red and blue strobing through the trees at the end of the private lane, resolving into 4 Greenville County Police Department cruisers, coming hard down the gravel, their sirens cutting across the water. The estate's security system had transmitted the priority alert the instant I activated it. Response time from the nearest unit, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Renata saw the cruisers and spun toward the house, screaming something at the sealed front entrance that I could not hear. The moment the police cruisers came into view, her whole body rearranged itself, same as it had done in my living room 10 days prior when officers first walked through the door. 1 second she was unraveling. The next, she was composed into something else entirely. The unhinged woman disappeared, and what took her place was a figure trembling and victimized someone who needed rescuing. Arms up, she sprinted toward the lead car, pointing back at the house, weeping, narrating, playing the terrorized wife whose senile father-in-law had baited her husband into a snare. Elliot's silver sedan rolled in behind the last cruiser. He emerged with his briefcase jacket buttoned to the collar, crossing the gravel with the unhurried calm of someone who had known this moment was coming and had been ready for it long before it arrived. I hit the release on my tablet. The steel shutter above the front entrance climbed its track with a mechanical groan. Derek crawled out through the gap on all fours, still coughing the crowbar abandoned somewhere behind him on the foyer tiles. Both hands went up the instant he registered the uniforms. He was talking, I could see his mouth moving, and I knew the shape of what he was saying without hearing it. The words about who he was, what he'd built, how this was all a misunderstanding. The commanding officer wasn't interested. They put him on the hood of the nearest cruiser fast, and without ceremony, face-down wrists pulled back. The cuffs engaged for the 3rd time in 12 days. When the officer read out the charges breaking and entering malicious destruction of property felony, violation of a permanent judicial protection order, he saved the final line for last and delivered it like a period at the end of a sentence that was now finished. You are being held without bail pending arraignment. Renata heard it and stopped performing. Whatever she had been holding together simply let go, and what came through in its place was unscripted, a sound that originated somewhere genuine, the sound of a door locking that is not going to open again. Elliot crossed to the commanding officer and handed over the restraining order paperwork, the security footage running from the moment the gate was struck, and a formal statement from my attorney. The officer read it, glanced in Renata's direction, and said something brief and low to a second officer who moved toward her. I descended the interior staircase, came out through the side entrance, and took a position on the stone steps. The red and blue light swept everything: the crumpled gate, the ruined front end of the leased SUV, the gravel, the faces. Derek was seated in the rear of a cruiser. Near the tree line, Renata stood with an officer, both arms locked around herself, like she was the only thing holding herself upright, her face undone in streaked mascara and bone-deep exhaustion. Her eyes found me on the steps, across all the gravel and light and accumulated distance, 12 days of it and the years that came before, and probably more than that. We looked at each other. Renata dropped her gaze first, her body folded inward, palms pressing over her face, and the crying that followed was nothing like the performance from earlier. It was deep and formless and came from somewhere that had no more tactics left. Elliot appeared at my shoulder. Neither of us spoke for a while. The officers worked through the cold October dark, and we stood and watched them finish. "It's done," Elliot said at last. "Finally." "Almost," I said. Then 6 months went by. Not quickly, not slowly. Time moves differently after something that size closes. Each day looked like an ordinary day and felt like something else underneath. Derek Schofield was processed as federal inmate number 84720 at a medium-security correctional facility in Estill, South Carolina, 45 minutes north of Charleston. The sentence was 58 months drawn from consolidated charges: wire, fraud, criminal bribery, felony assault of a person over 65 years of age. His firm was gone inside 2 weeks of the federal indictment becoming public knowledge. The professional relationships followed that particular variety of loyalty. that is really just proximity to success and dissolves the moment success does. The IRS moved on his remaining domestic assets without leaving much behind. The EPA fine of $85 million attached itself to him in a way no bankruptcy filing could remove. It would sit there accruing interest for the rest of his working life, a permanent tax on one arrogant afternoon in a strip mall conference room, where he couldn't be bothered to read what he was signing. Renata had given the federal prosecutors everything they asked for. Her plea deal stripped out every asset the marriage had produced, leaving her the clothes on her back and a credit history that would take years to rebuild from the ground up. The downtown condo went to foreclosure and auction. The cars were repossessed. The jewelry, the wardrobe, the social media profile assembled on top of someone else's money erased. She was in a studio apartment on Greenville's south side, riding the bus to a diner called Daybreak, on a commercial strip that smelled of diesel and fryer grease, working the overnight shift, carrying eggs and toast to truckers and factory workers until 4 in the morning. The woman who had swept into my living room, wearing a pressed wool coat to inform me she was claiming my bedroom, was now in non-slip shoes and a polyester uniform, and she wasn't done until the sky started getting light. Elliot reported all of this in his quarterly summary. No commentary, no editorializing, just the flat documented language of fact delivered evenly. I thanked him and kept the rest of it to myself. What I was actually thinking was that nothing about this felt like triumph. It felt more like standing in front of a house that burned down, necessary maybe, but not something you feel good about. Vera said nothing to me about Renata for 5 months. She kept to her rhythms, cooking, reading, walking the property line each morning in her wool coat while the mist came off the lake. In early March, she put bulbs in the ground along the south edge of the deck and told me they'd surface in April and not to mistake them for weeds. The second Thursday of that April, I came downstairs for coffee and she wasn't there. Her car was gone. 2 words on the kitchen counter in her handwriting, back soon. 2 hours later, she came in through the side door. She hung up her coat and stood at the sink, washing her hands with her back toward me, and I let her take her time. When she finally turned, her eyes were carrying something. Not tears running down, just that particular wet quality eyes have after something real has passed through them. I went to see her, Vera said. I set my mug on the counter. She was working her shift. She didn't know I was there. I took a corner booth and sat for a few minutes and just watched her. She was holding her voice level, and it was taking effort. She looks thin, Jean. She looks exhausted. Her hands have gone rough. Vera paused, lips pressed briefly together. She looks like a woman who is in the middle of a hard lesson and isn't sure yet whether she'll get to the other side of it. What did you do? I asked. Left her something. She reached into the cardigan pocket and brought out a small white envelope unsealed and set it in my hand. I opened it. The photograph from the state fair, the one that had lived on the kitchen counter of our old house for 30 years. Renata, at 7 years old, riding my shoulders, both of us caught in a full laugh, by a stranger Vera had handed her camera to. The frame had cracked the morning Derek sent it off the shelf when he and Renata walked in with their suitcases. I'd gathered up the pieces and packed them in my leather bag when I left. Someone had put it back together. The fracture lines were still there, fine white threads running across the image, but the photograph held. I looked at Vera. I had it repaired last month, she said. I thought I'd keep it, but when I woke up this morning, I knew she was the one who should have it. Something moved in my throat that I hadn't braced for. Did she see you go? I asked. No, Vera said. I was already out the door before she came back around to that section. She let the silence sit a moment. She hadn't wanted Renata to feel it came attached to anything. We settled at the kitchen table together, the morning light pressing through the glass, the lake spread out beyond the deck flat and silver in the April cool. A pair of ospreys had taken up residence in the tall pine at the water's edge. One of them stood at the rim of the nest, watching the surface below with the unhurried focus of a creature that has no use for rushing. I thought about 42 years of early mornings and steel-toed boots, the particular smell of industrial work that had once made my daughter look away at dinner parties. I thought about what all those years had actually produced, not just the financial structure Derek had tried to take, but the deeper thing underneath it, the capacity to outlast, to hold a plan, steady to stay still when stillness was the only move left. I reached across the table and laid my hand over Vera's. Her knuckles were warm and faintly roughened from her morning in the garden, and she turned her palm up and closed her fingers around mine without pulling her eyes from the window. Out on the water, the osprey pushed off from the nest's edge, shook its wings to their full reach, and drove itself out across the lake in one long, unbroken arc that carried it all the way to the far tree line and beyond. Vera watched until it was gone. "Do you think she'll call?" she asked. I looked down at our two hands joined on the table, scarred and calloused, 45 years acquainted with each other. "I think she'll need to work out who she is first," I said. "And then maybe she will." If you've stayed with me this long, then you already know this wasn't just a story about a deed or a court filing or a federal fine. It was about what it costs to be patient when everything in you wants to act, and what it means to protect the people you love even when they can't see that's what you're doing. Looking back, I won't pretend it left me clean. There were nights at that lake when I asked myself whether all the planning had taken something from me, whether I had spent so long thinking like my enemies that I had lost a step of myself in the process. I believe God kept Vera steady when I couldn't be, and I believe the Lord's timing on all of it was not an accident. For those of you who have lived a version of this, whether it is a family revenge story that nearly broke you, or a betrayal you are still trying to make sense of, here is what I would tell you, plainly as one person to another. When someone shows you their contempt, believe them the first time. Don't negotiate with it. Document everything not out of paranoia, but because the truth needs a record to stand on. And if you are over 50, understand this. The adults 50 plus among us are targeted precisely because people assume our patience is weakness. It is not. It is the longest game in the room. This has been a family revenge story, but at its center it was something quieter than revenge. It was about a man and his wife sitting at a kitchen table watching an osprey lift off the water, still holding each other's hands after 45 years. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. If you know someone who needs to hear it, pass it along. And if you haven't yet, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. There are more of these waiting for you. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you again soon.